Welcome back to Mission America, where we uncover the battles, the struggles, and the turning points that forged this nation. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey through America's most defining moments. Because today, we step onto a battlefield where the fate of the Republic itself hung in the balance. Imagine this. It's the summer of 1863. The Civil War has raged for 2 long years. Families torn apart, states divided, cities scarred. And now, under the blazing Pennsylvania sun, a confrontation is about to erupt that will decide whether America survives or falls apart forever. 3 days, over 160,000 soldiers, the largest battle ever fought on American soil. And at its heart, a question that would define the future. Would the Union endure, or would the Confederacy break away to form its own nation? This is the story of Gettysburg, the 3 days that changed America forever. And trust me, you won't see this battle the same way again. The spring of 1863 found the Confederacy riding high. Just weeks earlier, General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia had stunned the Union with a dramatic victory at Chancellorsville in Virginia. Despite being outnumbered, Lee's daring maneuvers shattered Union forces under General Joseph Hooker. But the cost was heavy. Lee's brilliant right-hand general, Stonewall Jackson, was mortally wounded. Still, the victory gave Lee confidence. The Union Army was demoralized. Northern newspapers were calling for peace, and across the Atlantic, Britain and France watched carefully, considering whether to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. Lee made a bold decision. He would invade the North. Why? Because the Confederacy needed more than just victories on Southern soil. Lee believed that by striking into Union territory, by threatening cities like Harrisburg, Baltimore, even Philadelphia, he could deliver a knockout blow. If he could win a decisive battle in the North, he might shatter Northern morale, force the Lincoln administration to the negotiating table, and secure independence for the Confederacy. But there was more. The farms of Virginia were stripped bare after 2 years of war. Lee's army needed food, supplies, and fresh ground to maneuver. Pennsylvania's rich farmland offered both. So in June 1863, Lee's 75,000 men began marching northward through the Shenandoah Valley, crossing into Maryland and then Pennsylvania. As they advanced, panic spread across the North. Newspapers warned, "The rebels are coming." Farmers fled, hiding livestock and supplies. Meanwhile, the Union Army was in turmoil. Just days before Lee's invasion, President Abraham Lincoln replaced General Hooker with a new commander, General George Gordon Meade. Meade was steady but relatively unknown. Could he rally the battered Union Army of the Potomac in time? The two armies moved like titans, circling one another, converging by fate on a small town in southern Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. But here's a question for you. What if Lee had chosen to bypass Gettysburg altogether? What if he had marched straight to Harrisburg or even Philadelphia? Would America today look completely different? We'll never know. But what we do know is this. By the last days of June, Confederate and Union forces were closing in on each other. And on July 1st, 1863, the first shots would be fired in a battle that neither side had fully planned for, but both sides would remember forever. The morning of July 1st, 1863 dawned hot and hazy over Gettysburg, a quiet farming town with barely 2,400 residents. It sat at the crossroads of 10 major roads. That geography, more than any strategy, made Gettysburg the accidental stage for the greatest battle ever fought on American soil. Picture the scene. Rolling farmland, fences stretching across fields of wheat and corn, ridges and hills rising gently above the town. It was here, amid barns, orchards, and stone walls, that two massive armies would collide. It began with a search for supplies. Confederate General Henry Heath had sent his men into Gettysburg looking for shoes. Yes, shoes. But what they found instead were Union cavalrymen under the command of General John Buford. Buford's cavalry, just 3,000 strong, saw what was coming. To the west, dust clouds rose. Confederate troops were advancing. Buford knew he couldn't stop them outright, but he could delay them long enough for Union reinforcements to arrive. And so, in the early hours, shots rang out on the outskirts of town. A skirmish quickly erupted into something far larger. Think about this for a second. One of the greatest battles in history, a clash involving over 160,000 men, all began over a chance encounter. Confederates looking for supplies, running headlong into Union cavalry who decided to hold their ground. Fate, chance, destiny, call it what you will, but Gettysburg was now set in motion. Buford knew the importance of high ground. From his vantage point, he could see the ridges and hills south of town. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top. Whoever controlled those positions would dominate the battlefield. So Buford's mission was clear: buy time. His cavalry fought dismounted, using their rifles like infantry, firing from behind fences and trees. For 2 critical hours they held off Heath's advancing Confederates. And then, like an answer to prayer, Union reinforcements began arriving. The 1st Corps under General John Reynolds. Reynolds was one of the Union's best commanders, respected by his men and trusted by Lincoln himself. As he rode forward to rally his troops, shouting encouragement, a Confederate bullet struck him down. Reynolds was killed instantly. The loss was devastating. Union soldiers cried out in anger and disbelief. One of their finest leaders was gone within minutes of entering the battle. Ask yourself this: if Reynolds had lived, could the first day at Gettysburg have gone differently for the Union? Could his leadership have prevented the chaos that was about to unfold? Through the late morning and afternoon, fighting raged across farms and ridges north and west of town. Union troops under Reynolds, now commanded by General Abner Doubleday, fought desperately to hold their lines. Confederate reinforcements under General Richard Ewell poured in from the north, while more Confederate divisions pressed from the west. By sheer numbers, the Confederates slowly pushed the Union troops back. Fields once golden with wheat turned red with blood. Fences were splintered by musket balls. Smoke choked the air. Civilians cowered in their homes, praying for the nightmare to end. By late afternoon, the Union line collapsed. Thousands of soldiers retreated in confusion through the streets of Gettysburg, while Confederate troops surged behind them. But amid the chaos, something crucial happened. Instead of continuing their retreat, Union forces regrouped on the ridges south of town: Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. Buford had been right all along. These heights were the key to the battlefield. General Lee arrived on the field that evening and faced a fateful decision. His officers urged him to press the attack and drive the Union off the hills before they could entrench. But Lee hesitated. He had already achieved a strong victory on day 1. His men were exhausted. He decided to wait until the next day. That choice, that single moment of hesitation, would prove critical. As night fell over Gettysburg, the Union Army dug in on the high ground, while Confederate forces gathered for another strike. Nearly 50,000 soldiers had clashed that first day. Casualties were staggering. Thousands dead, wounded, or captured. The people of Gettysburg could hardly believe what they had witnessed. Their small town was now a battlefield, and the war had come crashing into their lives in the most brutal way possible. Day 1 belonged to the Confederates, but the Union still held the high ground, and as both armies prepared for Day 2, the stakes could not have been higher. Because the next day, July 2nd, 1863, would bring some of the fiercest, bloodiest fighting of the entire war. The night of July 1st was tense and uneasy. The streets of Gettysburg were littered with abandoned muskets, shattered wagons, and the cries of the wounded. Thousands of soldiers lay in makeshift field hospitals, churches, barns, even private homes turned into scenes of unimaginable suffering. And yet, both armies knew the real test was still to come. The Union Army, now under General George Meade, had arrived in full strength. Nearly 90,000 Union troops dug into a defensive line that stretched in the shape of a giant fishhook from Culp's Hill on the right, curving down to Cemetery Hill, running along Cemetery Ridge, and ending at the rocky heights of Little Round Top on the left. The Confederates, with about 75,000 men, controlled the town of Gettysburg and the ridges to the west. Lee believed he had the momentum. He had beaten Union forces on Day 1. Why not finish the job now? But there was one problem. The Union Army held the high ground. To win, Lee would have to attack, and attack hard. At sunrise on July 2nd, Lee devised his strategy. He would launch a massive assault on both Union flanks, attacking their left at Little Round Top and their right at Culp's Hill. If he could roll up the Union line from either side, the fishhook would collapse and Meade's army would be destroyed. It was a bold plan, but it would demand flawless timing. Unfortunately for Lee, things began unraveling from the start. His orders were delayed. His generals misunderstood directions. The attack that should have begun at dawn didn't begin until late afternoon, and that delay gave the Union precious time to strengthen its positions. By mid-afternoon, Confederate General James Longstreet finally unleashed his divisions against the Union left. Waves of gray-clad soldiers surged forward toward places that would become etched in history: the wheat field, the peach orchard, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top. At Little Round Top, the Union line hung by a thread. The 20th Maine Regiment, under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, was given a desperate order: hold the line at all costs. Chamberlain's men fought furiously, repelling attack after attack. Ammunition ran low, men fixed bayonets, and then, when it seemed the line might collapse, Chamberlain made a bold decision. He ordered a bayonet charge down the hill. Exhausted Union soldiers swept forward with steel and sheer determination, catching the Confederates off guard and driving them back. The 20th Maine had held. Think about that moment. If Chamberlain and his men had broken, the Union left flank would have crumbled. The entire Union line could have been rolled up. Gettysburg, and perhaps the war, might have ended differently. Elsewhere, the fighting was brutal and chaotic. At the wheat field, control of the ground changed hands 6 times in just a few hours. Men fell in such numbers that survivors later said you could walk across the field without touching the ground, only stepping on the bodies of the dead. At Devil's Den, Union sharpshooters hid among the boulders, firing down on advancing Confederates. But the position became a slaughterhouse. The rocks ran red with blood. Confederate troops eventually captured the ground, but at horrific cost. While Longstreet hammered the left, Confederate General Richard Ewell attacked the Union right at Culp's Hill. But here too the Union held firm. Stone walls, trenches, and determined defenders repelled wave after wave of Confederate assaults. The fishhook line bent, but it did not break. By nightfall, the fields around Gettysburg were scenes of devastation. Men lay stacked in rows, cannon wheels splintered, the air filled with the stench of powder and death. Day 2 had been the bloodiest yet. Nearly 20,000 casualties in a single day, and still neither side had a clear victory. But here's the question that haunted Lee that night. Should he retreat, regroup, and fight another day? Or should he strike one more time, one last massive blow to shatter the Union Army once and for all? Lee chose the latter. He would attack again, this time at the very center of the Union line. And on July 3, 1863, that decision would lead to one of the most infamous moments in American history, Pickett's charge. The dawn of July 3, 1863, rose hot and heavy over Gettysburg. Smoke from the previous 2 days still lingered across the ridges. The dead lay unburied in the fields, their faces turned skyward beneath the blazing summer sun. Survivors on both sides knew the battle was reaching its climax. For General Robert E. Lee, retreat was unthinkable. He had come too far, risked too much. The Confederacy needed a decisive victory on Northern soil, and he believed that Gettysburg could provide it. So Lee prepared for one final all-or-nothing strike. The Union line stretched along Cemetery Ridge, a long, curving defense bristling with cannon and infantry. Lee believed that the Union center was its weakest point. For 2 days the flanks had been tested and held, so now, he reasoned, the center must be vulnerable. His plan was simple but audacious. Unleash a massive artillery bombardment to weaken the Union position, then send 15,000 Confederate soldiers straight at the heart of the Union line. If they broke through, the Union Army could collapse. Victory would belong to the South, but if they failed, it could mean disaster. At 1 p.m., the ground shook. Over 150 Confederate cannons roared to life, pounding the Union lines with shell after shell. The thunder was deafening. Civilians miles away thought the world itself was ending. Union cannons answered back, the air filled with shrieking metal. Horses bolted, men covered their ears, the very earth trembled. For nearly 2 hours it was the largest artillery duel of the war. But here's the twist. Much of the Confederate fire overshot its target. Union troops crouched low behind stone walls, spared from the worst of the bombardment. The Union cannons, by order of General Henry Hunt, fell silent, creating the illusion that they had been destroyed. Lee believed the barrage had worked. He gave the order for the assault. At around 3 p.m., a mile-long line of Confederate soldiers stepped out of the woods and into history. George Pickett's division, along with brigades under Pettigrew and Trimble, formed a gray wave stretching across the fields. Nearly 15,000 men advanced, shoulder to shoulder, bayonets glinting in the sun, flags fluttering. Drums beat, officers shouted. It was a sight so vast and terrible that Union soldiers watching from Cemetery Ridge could hardly believe their eyes. One Union officer muttered, "Here they come, and they will break upon this line like water against a rock." The Confederates marched steadily, but Union artillery soon opened fire. Shells ripped holes in the advancing ranks, men falling by the dozens. Still they came on, closing the distance. As they neared the Emmitsburg Road, Union cannons switched to canister, deadly blasts of iron balls that shredded entire lines. The fields became a slaughterhouse. Yet the Confederate wave kept pushing forward, climbing fences, reforming their ranks, surging toward the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. A group of Virginians under General Lewis Armistead broke through at a point near a small clump of trees, forever remembered as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead, hat raised on his sword, shouted to his men as they leapt over the wall and into Union lines. For a moment, it looked as if the Confederacy might break the Union center, but Union reinforcements rushed to the breach. Muskets fired at point-blank range. Bayonets clashed. Armistead fell, mortally wounded, crying out to send a message to his old friend, Union General Winfield Scott Hancock, who also lay wounded nearby. The Confederate surge collapsed. Survivors who reached the wall were captured, cut down, or forced back. In less than an hour, Pickett's charge was over. Of the 15,000 who began the assault, over half were killed, wounded, or missing. Entire brigades ceased to exist. When Lee asked Pickett to rally his division, Pickett reportedly replied with tears in his eyes, "General, I have no division left." The Union center had held. The Confederate gamble had failed. As the smoke cleared, Lee rode among his men, urging them to be of good heart, taking the blame upon himself. "It is all my fault." His soldiers still loved him, but they knew the truth. Gettysburg was a disaster. The Confederacy had reached its high water mark, its furthest advance into the North, its greatest chance at victory. From this moment on, the tide of war would turn against them. That evening, the fields of Gettysburg were eerily quiet. Tens of thousands of men lay dead or dying. The Union Army stood bloodied but unbroken. The Confederacy, though not yet defeated, would never again launch such a bold invasion of the North. And yet, the war was far from over. Lee's battered army would retreat, limping back to Virginia. Lincoln and the Union would grapple with what had been won and what still needed to be sacrificed. Gettysburg was over, but the Civil War still had 2 long years to go. The night of July 3, 1863 settled over Gettysburg with a heavy silence. The thunder of cannon had ceased, the clash of musket fire had faded, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the fields. The greatest battle ever fought on American soil was over, but the cost was staggering. In just 3 days, Gettysburg left behind over 51,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Entire families were shattered. Regiments that had marched into battle 1,000 strong staggered out with only a handful of survivors. The fields around Gettysburg were transformed into a hellscape of corpses, shattered weapons, and broken wagons. The stench of death lingered for weeks. Civilians caught in the middle of the storm now faced the grisly task of burying thousands of bodies and caring for tens of thousands of wounded soldiers. For the small Pennsylvania town, the war had come and gone in just 3 days, but its impact would last for generations. On the night of July 4th, the very day Americans celebrated their nation's independence, General Robert E. Lee began his retreat. His army, battered and broken, slipped away toward Virginia under the cover of rain. Lee had gambled everything at Gettysburg, and he had lost. The Confederacy would never again mount a serious invasion of Northern territory. From this point forward, the South would fight mostly on the defensive, its resources dwindling, its hope for foreign recognition slipping away. For President Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg was both a relief and a frustration. The Union had won, yes, but Meade, cautious in his command, failed to pursue and destroy Lee's army as it retreated. Lincoln lamented what might have been, saying, "Our army held the war in the hollow of their hand, and they would not close it." Still, the significance of Gettysburg could not be denied. Alongside the Union victory at Vicksburg on July 4th, it marked a turning point in the Civil War. But Lincoln knew the war was far from over. More blood would be shed before the Union was preserved. Months later, on November 19, 1863, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a new national cemetery on the battlefield. The ceremony was long, with speeches that droned on for hours. And then Lincoln rose. In just 272 words, he redefined the meaning of the war. He spoke of a new birth of freedom, of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, that must not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address transformed the battle into something greater than just a clash of armies. It became a symbol of what the United States was fighting for: unity, freedom, and the survival of democracy itself. So, what did Gettysburg mean? It was the high-water mark of the Confederacy, the closest the South ever came to victory. It proved the Union could stand firm, even against Lee's best, and it gave the North a surge of morale at a time when it was desperately needed. But it also revealed the staggering cost of the war. More Americans died at Gettysburg than in any battle before or since on U.S. soil. The scars, physical, emotional, political, would last long after the smoke cleared. Gettysburg was not the end of the war, but it was the moment when the tide turned, when the dream of Confederate independence began to fade, and when the hope of Union victory began to rise. 3 days, that was all it took for the fate of a nation to hang in the balance. At Gettysburg, the United States came closer than ever to breaking apart, and closer than ever to being reborn stronger than before. The Civil War would rage on for nearly 2 more years, but from the ridges and fields of Gettysburg, from the courage of men who refused to yield, the Republic endured. And in the words of Lincoln himself, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. This has been Mission America, bringing you the battles. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a journey into America's past. And tell us in the comments, if you stood on those fields in 1863, what choice would you have made? To advance, to retreat, or to hold the line? Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and where we're going.